And the Shaykh mentions that to study the books of the Salaf, and to study the texts, the standardized texts that are found amongst Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah, that this has great and mighty benefits. It has great and mighty benefits. And it is something that brings a student of knowledge. It ties him and it connects him to the Sunnah and to the guidance of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It is for this reason that we see that the scholars of Islam, of the Sunnah, and who are upon the way of the Salaf, that they always and constantly revolve around the likes of these texts. Now, these texts, when we speak of these texts, we mean those texts that were written by the scholars throughout all the different ages. Like, for example, the text written by Imam Ahmad rahimahullah, Usul al-Sunnah, and Imam al-Tabari rahimahullah, Sarih al-Sunnah, and likewise al-Barbahari rahimahullah, Sharh al-Sunnah. These are names of books that we are familiar with. And likewise throughout all the ages, the books of Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, the Aqeedah al-Tahawiyya, and the books of Ibn Taymiyyah, al-Wasitiyya, al-Hamawiyya, al-Tadmuriyya, and likewise the books of Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab on the topics of al-Tawheed, Kashf al-Shubahat, Kitab al-Tawheed, al-Qawaid al-Arba', and likewise certain lines of poetry that we find from them, which is this line of poetry, and likewise what is written by Ibn al-Qayyim and many other scholars. We see that the scholars of Ahlul Sunnah constantly always revolve around these texts. Why is this? The reason is because, to give you a quick analogy, the analogy is basically like if you have a ship which doesn't have an anchor, and this ship will be tossed in every direction. It will be led in every direction because it doesn't have something which holds it down and keeps it in place. And so these books and these texts that we study and that we revolve around and we constantly go through all the time and remind ourselves of, this has the effect of being like an anchor. It is something that gives someone stability and support and firmness. And without this, you see that a person is slowly, because knowledge of this deen is such, or the believer is such that he always forgets. It's easy to forget. Shubahat come to him. Ignorance comes to him. He forgets. Just naturally he forgets. And so because of all of these factors, it is from the natural tendency of a person to forget and to have shubahat, doubts, misconceptions enter into his knowledge. And for that reason we see that from the way of Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah, specifically those who are upon the way of the Salaf, is that they have a constant revolvement around these books of Aqeedah. Not for a single hour, or minute, or day, or week do they ever lose sight of the fact that in these books and in these texts is something that lies the safety and the purity and the protection of a Muslim's belief. And in this regard, we see that the people of the Sunnah are distinguished from all of the groups and the jama'at that you find that are present today, who claim to be working in the field of da'wah. And they're not really truly working in the field of da'wah, rather they have innovated methodologies, they have innovated programs. And they themselves are upon the very beliefs, the very ideologies and beliefs that split the ummah in the first place. So you will see amongst these jama'at and these groups, whatever they call themselves, Jama'atul Tabligh, Hizbut Tahrir, Al-Muhajirun, Ikhwanul Muslimin, or whatever names they give themselves. Amongst them you will find those who are upon the beliefs of the Jahmiyyah, those who are upon the beliefs of the Rafidah, those who are upon the beliefs of the heretical Sufis, the extreme Sufis, those who are upon the beliefs of the Qadariyah, and so on and so on and so on and so forth. This is because the concern of these groups isn't Aqeedah. It isn't to establish the correct and sound Aqeedah. Rather they have other specific goals unique to each and individual party. So the Jama'atul Tabligh, their goal is to bring you to the madhab of Abu Hanifa and bring you to the ra'i, the opinion which is found in the Hanafi madhab, and to bring you to the Maturidi Aqeedah. And the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the aim is to gather you into a mass and a lump, and then use you and employ you, your body, as means of a revolution, fomenting a revolution. And likewise with Hizb ut-Tahrir, likewise with all these political parties and groups, they have an objective which isn't the objective for which the prophets and messengers were sent, which was to correct the beliefs of the people which had gone astray regarding Allah, His names, His attributes, and to make all of ibadah for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And for that reason, it is from the distinguishing features and characteristics of Ahlul Sunnah, those who follow the way of Imam Ahmad and Abu Hanifa and Imam al-Shafi and Imam Malik and Sufyan al-Thawri and Imam al-Awza'i and all of the notable scholars of the first 3 centuries, that from their way is that they have a constant attention to these books and these texts, and they never ever get bored of speaking about Allah's names and attributes, or speaking about the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or speaking about the virtues of the Sahaba, or speaking about paradise, hellfire, belief in the unseen, the hawd, the shifa'ah. They never ever get bored of these kind of affairs. And we see, and this is found, and I've met people, you come across these people and they claim to be upon Salafiyah, and they really have a type of jahl which Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab mentions in his book Kashf al-Shubuhat. I'll mention that statement in a short while. But I've come across people and they say that when we go through books and we finish one particular book and then we begin another book, so let's say we finish a book on Tawheed, then we start another book on Aqeedah, when we finish this book, then we move to another book and another on. And then they say, but we've studied all this, we understand all this already. But we know all this, but we understand all this. And so this disease here that we see, Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, he alludes to this in his book Kashf al-Shubuhat. And he says something along the lines, is that from the greatest jahl, is the saying of a person, at-tawheed fahimnahu. Or he says, at-tawheed arafnahu, or fahimnahu. One of those two he says. That from the greatest elements of jahl is that a person comes along and he says, we know Tawheed. We know what Tawheed is. We understand what Tawheed is. Why is this from the greatest of jahl? Why is it from the greatest of jahl to make this remark? It is from the greatest of jahl to make this remark because Tawheed isn't something that is just understood. Tawheed is something that a person, he implements, he practices. It is something that if he's not careful, then shirk, minor or major, can easily enter into him and he can easily fall into that. And from the greatest of signs of this is that Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam, who is the greatest of the messengers of Allah after the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And you see how Allah has described him in the Quran, that he was Hanif, the upright one, that he was an ummah, meaning a nation in and of himself, that he was from the Muslimin, he wasn't from the Mushrikeen. And we see that in the Quran, Ibrahim Islam, he makes a dua. He says, "Oh Allah, oh my Lord, make me and my offspring to be far and remote from that we should worship idols." How can it be that Ibrahim alayhi salam is making a dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect him and his offspring from the worship of idols? Yet he is Ibrahim, the Hanif, the one who submits to Allah upon Tawheed. Why is this? And from the benefits that the scholars mentioned from this ayah in the Quran is that shirk, falling into shirk, is something that every single individual is susceptible to. No one can escape unless he is protected by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, unless he is saved by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, unless he is given this support by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so therefore, when we see people coming along and they're saying, we understand Tawheed, we know Aqeedah, we know this, we know that, this indicates that there is a sickness or a disease in the heart of such a person. Because maybe he's seeking, his heart doesn't find pleasure. His heart doesn't find serenity and calmness. His heart doesn't find further strengthening and the giving of yaqeen, further yaqeen, when he goes through a book on Aqeedah, a book on Tawheed, a book on, these kind of topics. So my dear brothers and sisters, we see that the scholars of the Sunnah never, ever, ever do they tire, or never ever do they ever deflect away from constantly focusing again and again and again and again upon the likes of these types of texts. Even if we study the same topics over and over and over again. Iman, Al-Qadr, the Sahaba, belief in the unseen, the angels and so on and so forth. Why? Because this is something that every Muslim, he needs exposure to all the time. It is the foundation of his relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So once we understand this point, once we understand and we really grasp this point that the Shaykh mentioned here, that the study of the books of the Salaf and the mutun, the Sharia texts, that it has fawaid azima, it has great and mighty benefits. And it is something that ties a student of knowledge with the Sunnah, with the guidance of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that's why there is such a revolvement around these types of texts, because it has a great benefit for the Muslims generally and for the student of knowledge specifically.